To Mrs. Gibsons by Toyomi Igus. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee. This Mrs. Gibson was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in Japan in a place called Gifu. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a great big fat bearskin rug. "Come here and give me some sugar," she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped in a light, down-filled comforter. At bedtime, she'd stroke my hair and hum Sakura until I fell asleep. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh and a big voice, which would get louder when she was angry or when she was singing, and she seemed to be singing all the time. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed, so you would never see her teeth. And when she was angry, she'd get even quieter. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands that could make the lightest, prettiest strokes of a pen when she would write our names in Japanese. Kumiki, Akimi, Toyami, Yoshitiru. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands. They looked like they covered all the keys on the piano when she played her favorite spirituals. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Sometimes this Mrs. Gibson would look kind of sad, and then she would let me dress up in one of the kimonos she had packed away in an old trunk. "These are very special," she would say as she tied the obi around my waist. "Don't get dirty." The other Mrs. Gibson's clothes were much too big for me to dress up in, but I liked to wear her fancy hats. "This is my Sunday go-to-meeting hat," she would say as she'd take the long pointy hat pin out of my hand. "Don't get it dirty now." In the evening, in the garden, this Mrs. Gibson would help me make magical lamps by catching fireflies and putting them in a jelly jar. They would glow and glow, and then we'd let them go. Later at dinner time, this Mrs. Gibson would make more magic. Her hands would turn little bits of napkins into a whole flock of long-necked cranes. We would throw them into the air where they would fly high and then flutter down to the ground. "Happy birds," she would always say. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking. We would eat it with bits of meats and vegetables on it, with plenty of shoyu. Anytime we were hungry, she could take her long chopsticks and stir up dinner in the blink of an eye. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. Turnip greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens from the garden. Everything she cooked seemed to take a long, long time. This Mrs. Gibson had short curly hair that she would oil and braid up every night while she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that would hang down over my forehead. I didn't like that braid, so I would go to the other Mrs. Gibson and she'd take it out. This Mrs. Gibson used to have a long, straight hair, but she cut it short and tried to make it curly. She said she wanted to be more American. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everybody called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. I called her Mommy because she was my mom. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Viola. Everyone called her V or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandma. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but they had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me.